Hello, I'm Peg Hofschneider from Captiva. Also, I'm 100% Irish, and I am a very brave Irishman because I stuffed my recently acquired size 14 body into my old size 10 St. Patty's Day dress. And see what you think. I would like to have told you lively and risque stories about early Captiva, but on second thought, I'm too young to be sued for defamation. Instead, I will give you a very brief history of Captiva Cemetery, Captiva Chapel by the Sea, and Captiva Memorial Library. I have brought a small memento of our historical library, which is a bookmarker marking our centennial, and has a picture of our first homesteader. Perhaps this little bookmark will remind you of me, and you will send a silent thought my way when you use it. I am also a very humble Irishman, standing before you in an attempt to tell you about old Captiva, when the Grand Dame of Captiva is a member of your organization and could probably relate to you much more of Captiva history. Mrs. Sarah Sims, I salute you. Just a little bit about how we came to live and love Captiva. In 1943, I met my husband Leo in Southport, Australia. We were married 30 days later and are now approaching 47 years of marriage. We were both headed into the combat area. He, a 29-year-old physician in the infantry, me, a 24-year-old nurse attached to the 5th Air Force, evacuating the wounded by plane. In 1947, after we had started a family, a home, and an office, we finally had two quarters to squander, and we arrived at the Island Inn on Sanibel. That same day, we discovered Captiva. In 1967, after many annual and then semi-annual vacations, we purchased 8.5 acres on Sanibel and 2 bayfront lots on Captiva. At that time, there were probably no more than 30 people living on the 2 islands and very little tourism. We came to know and had a great love of a lot of wonderful people we call natives. In 1970, we built a modest home on Captiva and retired in 1974. So you can understand how we came to love and have interest in the people and the island's history. It does go back for some time. Just because this coincidence tickles my fancy, Captiva was homesteaded by 4 men whose last name began with the letter B. Binder in 1988, Bates, date unknown, Bryant 1899, and Brainerd 1903. In 1988, Captiva celebrated a centennial party honoring Mr. William Bender, our first homesteader, who remained a bachelor for his whole life. I will start with our lovely old cemetery. The cemetery land is approximately 210 feet by 210 feet, with a 10-foot wide path on the south side leading to the Gulf. And it was homesteaded in 1888 by William Herbert Bender from Austria, Florida, who died April 26, 1932, and is buried in the Captiva Cemetery. Mr. Bender, a shipwrecked sailor, arrived on Captiva via floating debris from his wrecked ship. Anne Emma Brainerd, 1890-1901, daughter of Hattie E. and Herbert D. Brainerd, along with her parents and her brother Gordon, immigrated from Canada in 1900 and immigrated to Buck Key. When the Brainards left Canada, the children's grandmother gave them both a gold coin. Gordon squandered his coin, but Aunt Emma saved hers. While living on Buck Key, Aunt Emma and her mother would paddle their boat to Captiva and walk along the shell-strewn beach. Aunt Emma was so enthralled with the beauty of Captiva Beach that in 1900, approaching Christmas time, she prevailed on her parents to allow her to purchase with her gold coin a small plot of land from Mr. Bender. Her parents permitted her to buy the land, and Aunt Emma was an excited little girl. In her excitement, she told her mother that when she died, she wanted to be buried on her land. Her unusual request was very prophetic, as in 1901, Aunt Emma stepped on a foreign object and she died of tetanus soon thereafter. Her parents buried her on her own land, and she rests there today. In 1903, the Brainerd family moved to Captiva from Buckeye. They purchased a large tract of land from Mr. Bender, a portion of which was donated as a cemetery for islanders. This land was adjacent to the Lee County erected Captiva schoolhouse and surrounded Aunt Emma's grave. Later they brought their 4 deceased infants and placed them close to Aunt Emma. 1897, 1899, 1902, and 1903. Their son Gordon died April 12, 1912. His father Herbert died January 20, 1914. Both are buried in the Captiva Cemetery. Hattie Brainerd later married Alvin M. Gore. They also are buried in the Captiva Cemetery. At that time, anyone needing a plot for burial were welcome to use the Captiva Cemetery without a fee. However, any donation was accepted and the monies used for upkeep of the land. Presently, as space in the cemetery is at a premium, the Board of Captiva Chapel by the Sea, who are caretakers for the cemetery, asks that you be a parishioner and, if possible, make a $200 donation. This lovely old cemetery is a quiet, peaceful, well-tended area. Because of lack of space, only cremains are accepted now. Chapel by the Sea. In 1901, the first school was established on Captiva Island. William Herbert Bender, a homesteader, 1888, donated beachfront land, 240 feet wide, and because of beach erosion over the years, the property is now about 200 feet deep. That same year, Lee County erected a one-room schoolhouse on the donated property. This property is the present site of the Chapel by the Sea. The school was attended by students from Sanibel as well as Captiva Island. In addition to serving as a school, the building was used by the circuit preacher from the mainland for religious services. Whenever possible, the circuit preacher was brought from the mainland by boat to conduct services for residents of both islands. On these occasions, the participating residents not only attended religious services, but proceeded to have picnics, games, and generally enjoyed the beach and a community get-together. Because the only access to the island was by boat, the preacher was sometimes forced to remain on Captiva until the weather permitted his return to the mainland. Since bad weather occurred frequently, the residents constructed a small wooden lean-to on the property to the south of the main building. It was furnished only with a cot and a candle for the guests' use. This structure remains today and has been enlarged as needs arose. In 1951, a garage was added to the east end of the building, and a room for storing hymnals and folding chairs was added to the west end of the building. The middle room was used as a study for the preachers. As worshipers increased in numbers, the overflow from the chapel were forced to sit out of doors. In mid-1960, a public address system was installed, and the overflow worshipers were able to follow the services in the chapel. In 1982, the garage, study, and storeroom were remodeled. The 3 rooms were paneled, and large cantilevered windows were installed facing the chapel, making it possible for the overflow worshipers to sit under cover from the weather and still follow services. The study also serves as a dressing room for brides. This building is located north of the manse, which was established in 1950. The teachers using the first schoolhouse were Mr. Robert Knowles and Mrs. first name unknown Faley. Mr. Knowles, at the age of 88, died 2 years ago. He had resided on Sanibel. Mrs. Faley was not only a teacher in the Captiva school, she also was a licensed sea captain. She was dubbed Mrs. Captain Faley by the students. Mrs. Captain Faley had a job to do on land, and since her husband was a local fisherman of very little navigational skill, she would set Mr. Fadley adrift every morning on her way to work. Actually, Mr. Fadley took secret nips while he was out fishing. During recess, our class break, she would direct her students to place a line adrift, locating the hapless Mr. Fadley, and guide her husband safely ashore with his daily catch. Over a period of time, this original schoolhouse was allowed to fall into disrepair. In 1918, the county abandoned the old schoolhouse and constructed a new schoolhouse on property purchased for this purpose. This land was located about 1/2 mile south of the present site of Redfish Pass. At the time of construction, Redfish Pass did not exist. The land on which this new school was located was approximately mid-island on the Gulf side. The school existed on this site for approximately 1 year, since there were only 2 students, Joe Whiteman and Henry Rhodes. The school was closed. The island residents renovated the original school building and maintained it as a Sunday school. On June 7, 1921, encouraged by Mrs. Hattie Brainerd, the Board of Trustees of the Florida Annual Conference Methodist Church, a corporation, purchased the building and the land from Lee County and converted the school to a chapel. Since there were few Methodist parishioners on the islands, this venture proved unsuccessful. At that time, the chapel was known as the Wayside Chapel. In early 1940, Mrs. Miriam Johnson held Sunday school in the renovated structure. In 1947, the building became known as Captiva Chapel by the Sea. Non-sectarian, irregularly scheduled services began, and attendance increased considerably. The circuit preacher was once again a visitor to the island. Between 1947 and 1948, the chapel reorganized under the sponsorship of the Captiva Civic Association, and the first regular service was held on December 26, 1948. The subsequent services were conducted by Reverend C.W. Kennedy, beginning on January 2, 1949. For the next few years, regular services were conducted from November until Easter, with Reverend Kennedy arriving on Captiva on the Saturday mailboat and departing on the Monday mailboat. During his visits, he was the guest of Gulfview Inn, owned by Mr. and Mrs. Roy Wiedekin, now the Mucky Duck Restaurant at the end of Andy Rossi Lane at the Gulf. Reverend Kennedy conducted his last service at the Captiva Chapel by the Sea on April 29, 1951. From May to the end of October, there were no regular services held at the chapel. In 1950, the manse was built on chapel property for the use as a residence by permanent or visiting ministers and preachers and their families. It was constructed from monies donated for this purpose. On June 3, 1950, the first wedding was held in the reorganized chapel. It was the wedding of Sarah Ruth Wiedekin, daughter of Roy and Dorothy Wiedekin, and John M. Bailey, brother of Francis Bailey. The Bailey family resided on Sanibel Island. In April 1951, Reverend Kennedy baptized June Rossi, daughter of deceased Dessa and Andy Rossi, and Charlotte and Carolyn Wiles, daughters of Beulah, a current Captiva resident, and T.M. Wiles, who is deceased. The first funeral held in the Captiva Chapel by the Sea was for Mrs. John Engel, farmer, owner of Twin Palm Cottages, and mother-in-law to Francis Bailey. On April 21, 1952, the Captiva Chapel by the Sea was incorporated. On January 13, 1954, the Board of Trustees of the Florida Annual Conference of the Methodist Church sold the building to the corporation, Captiva Chapel by the Sea, for $2,500. The first payment was made in May 1953, and the last payment was made in February 1954. At the time of the sale, the cemetery adjacent to the chapel property was deeded to the corporation. The corporation refused to purchase the cemetery property, but agreed to accept responsibility for perpetual maintenance. In 1961, there was a small addition made to the chapel in memory of Herman Dickey, whose daughter, Marie Dickey Coleman, still resides on Captiva. The present Chapel by the Sea is governed by the annually elected chapel board. There is no regular congregation, but the congregation is comprised of residents and visitors of both Captiva and Sanibel Island. The chapel is still non-sectarian. The visiting minister is interviewed by the chapel board and engaged for a period of 1 year. His contract may be renewed, with his term not to exceed 3 consecutive years. He is compensated by chapel donations. And our Captiva Memorial Library. The Captiva Library originated in 1928 when, according to True Tales of Old Captiva, Captiva Civic Association 1984, the first library on Captiva occupied the office of John R. Dickey. Mrs. John Dickey, Mrs. Herman Dickey, and Mrs. Trula Hicks officiated from 1928 to 1932. Library services to Captivans continued during the 1930s in one form or another and were an activity of the Captiva Civic Club, the Women's Civic Group, which was established on December 2, 1935, followed by the Captiva Civic Association, established on February 3, 1936. The first recorded reference to the library appears in the January 1940 minutes of the Women's Auxiliary of the Captiva Civic Association, when it was reported that library needs and plans were then discussed informally. All members were willing to volunteer their services during the hours it was open, and a definite schedule was to be worked out within 2 weeks. It was also decided to continue library rates as charged by Mrs. Chapman. It was agreed that 6 new books be purchased immediately, titles to be chosen by a committee appointed by the president. The first recorded library budget appears in the January 40 minutes. Clearing path to post office, $1.65. Rubber stamps for library, 50 cents. New books, $12.84. It was further recorded that new books bought from Baker and Taylor, New York, included Watch for the Dawn, Stuart Cloetti, Maud, by Richard Stout, Moment in Peking, Lin Yutang, Kitty Foyle, Christopher Morley, Out of the Dust, Shocking, Escape, Ethel Vance. 50 years later, Baker and Taylor is still one of the library's book jobbers, and 2 of the first 6 books purchased are still in the collection, Watch for the Dawn and Kitty Foyle. Most important, Uncle Joe Whiteman, who cleared the path to the post office back in 1940, is still in the community and was honored at the 4th Annual Lee County Library Board and Friends Luncheon held at Twin Waters Inn on February the 1st, 1985. This occasion also commemorated the 15th anniversary of the new library. The next significant historical landmark occurred in 1959-60, when Bunty Robb, retired Captiva librarian, notes in her preface to True Tales. In 1959, Mr. and Mrs. Roger Armory of Boston endowed the charming Johann Hust Library at Boca Grande, and during the winter months from 1960 to 1962 used to deliver books to the other barrier islands on their cruiser Pappas II, stopping weekly at Captiva. About this time, in 1960, the Captiva Civic Association building was finished. There were several shelves of books accumulated, augmented by book gifts from the armories. The excerpts from the minutes of the Captiva Civic Association reproduced below provide a chronological outline of significant development during the next 18 years. 3/25/64. Motion made and carried to approve joining county library services. 1/7/65. Motion made and carried that land be acquired and a library built. 3/7/66. Plans shown for new library. Committee to raise money. 1/16/67. Estimate of $7,000 from Carl Whiteman. 9/4/68. Contract awarded to Carl Whiteman. 2/1/70. Dedication of library. 4/22/80. Dedication of addition to library. Although the motion to join Lee County Library Service was made and approved on March 25, 1964, the formal agreement between Lee County Library Board and the Captiva Library Committee was not formally signed until January 14, 1967. However, from the spring of 1964 onward, the Captiva Library was an integral part of the Lee County Library structure. On June 29, 1965, Mrs. Grace Tomlinson, librarian of Lee County Free Library, requested the first monthly circulation statistics beginning with May 1965. Within 2 years, circulation had tripled, and by 1984 had increased to over 15,000 items a year. The history of Captiva Library is reflected in the many hundreds of islanders who have been involved with it during the past 57 years. From early days in the Dickey House to the expansionist 60s when Pentard Mills, who supervised the construction of the 1970 building, and Mrs. Hervey Roberts brought the library into Lee County system, the library would not have existed without the dedicated efforts of Captivans. The name itself reflects the people of the island, and it was Paul Everett, then president of the Captiva Civic Association, who put Memorial in Captiva Library. Since the addition in 1980 of the new wing, made possible by the generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Don Seymour, the Captiva Memorial Library is already straining at the seams. With our expanding collection and growing public services, space will be a critical concern during the last half of the 80s. Now, in 1990, it seems that as each decade passes, we enhance our wonderful library. All of our membership cards and over 20,000 volumes have been barcoded, and we will go online shortly, bringing automation and efficiency, plus bringing orderly confusion to our patrons and volunteers. I am sure that you agree with me that facts are boring but safe. I would certainly like to have told you all about romances and intrigue, but I do have a cautious nature.